Whilst I alone did call upon thy aid, my verse alone had all thy gentle grace. But now my gracious numbers are decayed, and my sick muse doth give another place. I grant, sweet love, thy lovely argument deserves the travail of a worthier pen. Yet what of thee thy poet doth invent, he robs thee of, and pays it thee again. He lends thee virtue, and he stole that word from thy behaviour. Beauty doth he give, and found it in thy cheek. He can afford no praise in thee, but what in thee doth live. Then thank him not for that which he doth say, since what he owes thee, thou thyself dost pay. So, sonnets 78 through 86 are what we refer to as the rival poet sonnets. And in case you haven't gathered yet, that's because in them, Shakespeare is expounding on having to compete for the fair youth's affections with this rival poet. Now, there's lots of debate and speculation as to who this rival poet was, and we'll get to that, believe me. But for right now, I just want to point out, I think it's pretty clear from context clues that the fair youth was sleeping around with anybody and everybody at this time, men and women alike. But of all the people that he had affairs with, the only two people that seem to bother Shakespeare enough that he mentions them directly in the sonnets are the Dark Lady, which makes sense because that was Shakespeare's own mistress and that would have felt like a personal slight, and this rival poet. And I think part of the reason this rival poet gets under Shakespeare's skin so much is because he's like, wait, someone else is writing poems for you? That's my thing. I'm the one who writes sonnets for you. I've been writing sonnets for you since before it was cool. You know, this rival poet seems to be threatening Shakespeare's identity and pride as a writer and the underlying foundation of his relationship with the fair youth. And so he gets very catty in some of these sonnets, and it's really fun. Just digging into this one, he's saying basically, you know, when I alone got to call you my muse, my sonnets were great. They were full of life. But now that I have to share you with someone else, my sonnets are getting stale. I get it. And you're all into this new poet. Well, let me just say, this new poet of yours is not all that. And let me tell you why. Because he calls you virtuous. Well, he didn't know what virtue was until he learned it from your behavior. And he calls you beautiful. Well, he didn't know what beauty was until he saw it in your cheek. He is just stating the obvious. Any praise that he gives you in his poems is just stating what's already there. So, in conclusion, this new poet of yours is not all that. He sucks. I rule. The end. I mean, that's clearly the Cliff Notes translation, obviously. Getting into the possible identities of this rival poet, two of the names that get proposed most often are George Chapman and Christopher Marlowe. And that makes sense because they were two of the most famous writers at that time, and it would make sense that Shakespeare would be threatened by them. My only issue with that theory is that because they were so famous, you'd think that some of their poems to the fair youth would survive, and that we could compare them with Shakespeare's sonnets and from context clues be able to determine that they were both about the same person. But those poems don't seem to exist. Of course, they could have been lost, but they don't exist. There's also a theory that the rival poet was Shakespeare's amalgamation of several poets who were writing about the fair youth, and that's possible. But I was reading a really, really interesting paper today about that was arguing that the rival poet was actually the Earl of Essex. Now, if there are any fans of the Queen Elizabeth movies or miniseries or whatnot, you will know that Essex was Elizabeth's favorite, her lover, who led a rebellion against her, and she ended up cutting off his head for treason. If that's the case, that's really interesting to me because I think that the fair youth was the Earl of Southampton. We can get into lots of arguments about who and why, but I think that the fair youth was probably the Earl of Southampton. And in that case, the connection between Southampton and Essex is very clear, because Southampton was involved in the rebellion against Queen Elizabeth right alongside Essex. He was actually sentenced to death along with him, but because Elizabeth was concerned that Southampton's death would elicit sympathy from his countrymen, she stayed his execution, and Essex alone was executed. And it would make sense also that Essex poems to the fair youth wouldn't survive, because although we know that Essex wrote poetry and that he was very smart and capable and all that, he wasn't primarily known as a poet. So if he wasn't especially well renowned for his poetry, it would make sense that those poems wouldn't survive. Then you might say, well, why would Shakespeare be jealous of someone who's clearly an inferior poet? Well, because it's not all about the poet's ability. It's about competing with the poet for the fair youth's affections. And that makes sense to me. I don't know. All of this is speculation. We just don't have enough hard evidence. So we can't know for sure, but it's really fun to speculate anyway. So I can't help it. If you're interested in any of this, Wikipedia it, because there's so much more to it and I just can't get into all of it here. But anywho, I'll be back tomorrow with more of the rival poet sonnets. And in the meantime, stay safe. Have a great day. Love to you all. Bye.